So we have Kate Hazelhall moderating today, and Danielle Binks, Nicki Greenberg, and they can talk to you now.
Thank you, Jo. So hello and welcome to this session of the Port Fairy Literary Weekend called Writing History for Younger Readers. I'm Kate Hall. I'm delighted to introduce to you two of Australia's best known and award-winning children's and young adult authors, Danielle Binks and Nicki Greenberg. Nicki and Danielle are here today to talk to us about two incredible novels, The Year the Maps Changed and The Detective's Guide to Ocean Travel. So before we get started with that, I just wanted to take a moment to acknowledge the Peak-Warrong and Gunditjmara peoples as traditional custodians of these unceded lands and waterways on which we're gathering today. And as this is a literary festival, I'd like to pay my particular respects to the wisdom and beauty of Gunditjmara's stories and language, which were the first language and stories spoken in this place. I also pay, of course, my deep respects to elders past, present and future, and to any Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander peoples who may be with us today. So, Danielle Binks is a Melbourne-based writer and literary agent with Jacinta de Marze Management. In 2017, she edited and contributed to Begin and Begin, an anthology of new Australian young adult writing inspired by the hashtag LoveAusYA movement, which won the ABIA Book of the Year for older children, ages 13 plus. The Year the Maps Changed, Danielle's debut middle grade novel, hold up novel please, was a 2021 Children's Book Council of Australia notable book and is 2022 forthcoming in North America with Quill Tree Books. Her first solo YA novel is The Monster of Her Age, forthcoming in August 2021. And can I say how excited I am about that? And, you know, if there were any early copies floating around, we can talk about that later.
Let's talk afterwards, yeah. Especially if I'm going to be launching that one, not in a lockdown. Okay. I'm just going to be giving those things out on the street corner. You watch me.
Fingers crossed that that's not going to happen. Okay, and Nicki Greenberg is an award-winning author and illustrator of more than 30 books, including works of fiction, picture books, and graphic novels. Her latest books are The Detective's Guide to Ocean Travel, a rollicking mystery set on a real life golden age ocean liner, and I'm Fabulous Crab, a sparkly picture book written in verse. Nicki loves surprise twists, nailing a rhyme, and getting lost down the research rabbit hole. Me too. In her past life, she worked as a lawyer. Would you please welcome Danielle and Nicki? All right, you two. Can we please hear a little bit about each of these books, and maybe could you give us a short reading from each? And we're going to start with you, Nicki.
Lovely. Thank you.
So the Detective's Guide to Ocean Travel is a rollicking classic whodunit. It's set in 1927 on board the great ocean liner RMS Aquitania, which was a real ship and the kind of ship that doesn't exist anymore. This was the golden age of transatlantic travel, where these ships were like enormous floating cities with every social stratum represented. Our protagonist is Pepper Stark. She is the daughter of the captain of this ship, never allowed to set foot on the ship until now. She's 13 years old. And when she's on board, this is a very longed-for voyage, a crime occurs. A world-famous, priceless, infamous diamond goes missing, and she becomes implicated in the crime. And her father, the captain's position, is at stake as a result. So very high stakes set in this very lavish, glamorous, extravagant world. And Pepper and some other kids who she meets on board have to solve this crime. There's my elevator pitch.
So good.
And so would you like me to read now, or would you?
That would be fabulous.
Okay, terrific. So I was tossing up whether to read the moment when Pepper first sees the ship, or when Pepper first sees Perdita West, who is, of all of the stars and glamorous people on this ship, the most famous, the most glamorous. And I'm going to give you Perdita West. The crowd in the foyer turned as one, like iron filings drawn to a magnet. Now they've got what they wanted, said Lyons gruffly. This'll give them something to brag about when they get home. Who is it? Pepper asked. You'll see soon enough. Pepper stood on tiptoe. All she could see was a clutch of photographers, dozens of them, crab walking precariously backwards down the staircase, their cameras pointed up at the landing above. Flashbulbs popped and sparked. Elbows jostled. They were calling out as if she were a racehorse. Miss West, over here. It was a wonder the whole lot of them didn't topple down the stairs. Miss West. Perdita West. That's who it must be. The American stage sensation whose languid eyes gazed out from magazine covers and playbills and advertisements for face creams that promised to make anybody look like a star. But there was nobody like Perdita West. The pack of photographers scuttled back further, and there she was, rising above their heads like the figurehead of a ship breasting the waves. Oh, she was beautiful, even more beautiful than in the pictures. She sashayed slowly down the staircase, her famous full-lipped mouth set in a bemused smile. Her dark hair was waved and coiled in a glossy chignon, and a navy blue cloak fell in luxurious folds from her shoulders. She was dressed for the daytime, but around her neck hung a necklace fit for a ball at Buckingham Palace, a heavy gold collar framing a single enormous diamond, the colour of the sun. Now the photographers drew aside, and Pepper gasped in amazement. Here was something more extraordinary still. In front of the actress, an actual leopard was making its stately way down the stairs.
So good. So good. Thank you. And may I say that Perdita West's outfits throughout the entire novel are extraordinary. And I could picture each one. And each one is more glamorous than the last. Thank you, Nicki. Danielle, tell us about your book.
So Nicki's book is set in 1927. My book is set in 1999, and that does make it historic fiction. Can we have a show of hands? Who lived through 1999? Who was around in 1999? Okay. It's historic fiction for all of us, and we just have to sit with that knowledge and let it simmer, as I did, for the 5 years it took to write the book. Because I think those 5 years was probably spent just reconciling with the fact that my childhood was now history. But my book is set in 1999 because that's the year of something called Operation Safe Haven, which remains Australia's largest ever humanitarian exercise during the Kosovo War, when about 4,000 refugees were brought over to Australia and housed at 8 different safe havens all around the country, one of which was kind of close to where I live at Point Nepean, the old disused quarantine station. And I don't need to explain what a quarantine station is anymore, I don't think, even though the last time it was used was, well, it was the quarantine station used during the 1918 flu pandemic. And there was a leper colony there as well, but then they reopened it for the refugees of the Kosovo War, who were mostly Muslim Albanian refugees as well. So my book is about a year in the life of my young protagonist, Winifred Fred, whose life is already a little bit topsy-turvy. Her father's girlfriend is having a baby and has moved in with them, along with her young son, and Fred is the very reluctant older sister that she never wanted to be. And her grandfather's also in hospital recovering from a fall he had. So her world's a little bit topsy-turvy. And then the outside world comes knocking, it seems. And the little section I'm going to read, and this is my first ever reading, because my book came out in April 2020, and with a title like The Year the Maps Changed, serves me right. I should have called it The Year Everything Went Perfectly and According to Plan, but I didn't. So this is just a little scene in the classroom, and there are some young people here today. Hopefully this feels a little bit like a discussion that you'd have in your classrooms. It had been raining so much that the gutters of our school overflowed and the water seemed to roar down like rapids outside the window. It was the start of April and warm outside, so the classroom became sticky from the damp and the heat. Or maybe that was just from the questions that we had burning inside us. After recess, Jed stuck his hand up. What about the National Anthem? Mr. Corey said could say a lot with his eyebrow arch. This time, the eyebrow seemed to say, "Go on, continue." It's like we have to sing it every week in assembly, but does it even mean anything? What line are you thinking of specifically? Mr. Curry asked the question like he already knew the answer. And Jed probably only meant to speak, but after so many years singing the anthem, his voice came out with a sing-song lilt, like the words wanted to rise up. For those who've come across the seas with boundless plains to share. The sound of us agreeing with him was a hum, low and sure. You're right, Mr. Curry said. Those words are in our national anthem. Are we just supposed to sing them but not believe in them? A Year 5 girl asked. Mr. Curry leant forward in his chair at the front of the room, put his hands on his knees and looked at us. I think that's something each of you will have to ask yourselves, he said. What is the purpose of a national anthem, and what does it mean when a country refuses to live by its traditions? He wasn't like other teachers we'd had or other grown-ups we knew. On the first day of term, he'd written the words, "Not all those who wander are lost," at the top of the blackboard, and they were still up there, looking down on us. Back on that very first day of school, he'd said he hoped the words would remind us that it's okay to follow your curiosity, even if you don't know exactly where it will lead. And the point of life was not to have all the answers, but to never stop asking questions.
Thank you. So fabulous. And Mr. Curry is the kind of teacher that if you're lucky enough to have a teacher like that, you never forget them.
Yes,
and without spoiling things that happen in the novel, which of course you should all purchase and read immediately if you haven't done that. Ditto, of course, with Nicki's book. He ends up doing marvelous things, you know. And I don't know if I had a teacher as good as Mr. Curry, but when I was reading your book, I was thinking about several primary school teachers I had who came close. Close.
He's probably an idealised, but he's also a combo of a lot of teachers who I had growing up. And I come from a family of a lot of teachers. So he's kind of, you know, an amalgamation of all of them. And he is one of my favourite characters to write. And I have been delighted at the people who say they have a bit of a crush on him. Older readers, I should say, have a bit of a crush on him. And I think he's very crushable. It's very understandable.
He's a bit likeable for the mums, some of the mums. Lovely. Okay. All right. Well, thank you both for those delightful readings. I would love to start by, you know, the formal questions part of this, by asking you to say a little bit more about the very different historical contexts of each of your novels, and maybe about why you're so interested in a particular time and place in which your books are set. So can we start with you this time, Danielle?
Oh, I was looking at you like, but no, it's me.
So in an essay which people can read on the Hachette website, you've written that you were the same age as Fred, or Winifred, your protagonist, in 1999, in the year the novel is set. And in that essay, you also wrote something that I find really fascinating, and so I'm going to quote here. So, quote, "The old writer's advice is to write what you know. I didn't do that exactly. I wrote instead what I wanted to know. I wanted to remember this time from the depths of my childhood when the outside world came to my back door, it seemed." End quote. Can you tell us a little bit more about that and about why this particular historical time, place, context and series of events?
Well, the trigger for me revisiting 1999 was in the lead up to our last state election. We had the Victorian opposition Liberal leader Matthew Guy suggesting reopening the Point Nepean quarantine station and using it as a detention centre for refugees today. And surprisingly, this was suggested in a few state elections around Australia. Singleton in New South Wales had a similar discussion about using their disused army barracks as a detention centre. And in both cases, the towns that would have been affected by that said flat out, no, we don't want that. We remember Operation Safe Haven. And it wasn't what detention is now for refugees and asylum seekers. And I was quite moved that it wasn't, not in our backyard response. It was a no, don't taint our memories of that time response. So that was what sent me off as well. And I could only very vaguely, proof positive, I was 12 at the time. That was me back in 1999. That's how old my character is in the book. I wasn't up on current world events at the time, amazingly, but that being pulled back into our discussions in that election and the news pulled me back into that time, and I decided to go and dive deep into it. And what I found was in 1999, we hadn't been as jaded, we hadn't become as used to the propaganda of certain governments. And the Australian people were actually pressuring John Howard at the time to do something during the Kosovo War. And Philip Ruddock, the foreign minister, said at one point, we can't fly plane loads of refugees into the country. It can't be done. And then lo and behold, just after Easter, they did exactly that, as did America, as did England. It was this huge response of mostly Muslim refugees and the Australian people insisting that they come over here and be protected. And it was images that were beamed into their lounge rooms that really propelled this kindness. And one image in particular that I think, when I saw it, I thought, yes, I'm going to write about this. I need to know about this. And it was this image. It was this image of a child at a refugee camp on a Kosovo border that looked really scary and harrowing to me until I read the caption that said they'd just been reunited with their family. So it was current events of the time in the lead up to the election. It was remembering very vaguely growing up during this time, and then realizing that this was the domino effect, because you realize Operation Safe Haven of 1999 happens, then the East Timor crisis happens, then 2001 9/11 happens, and it is like a domino effect. You can literally map how Australia changed their outlook and their worldview when it came to refugees and asylum seekers. And it was all within the one government of John Howard. You know, he was there shaking hands with refugees. And I just, looking at these photographs of John Howard meeting refugees coming off the Qantas plane, shaking hands, hugging babies, I thought, when would you see another Prime Minister of Australia doing that to refugees? You just wouldn't. You're not going to see Peter Dutton out there shaking hands with refugees saying, welcome, welcome. It's just never going to happen again. So I really wanted to go and investigate that, because the only reason has got to be because of where we are now with our terrible humanitarian rights abuses of refugees and asylum seekers. But I found it so fascinating that it wasn't too long ago that we were actually kind of on the right path. And I thought how wonderful that 1999 was so close that young people reading my book could ask their parents and grandparents and teachers and any adults in their life about what was that time like. And they could actually have a conversation with them about that. And maybe the conversation is, what is dial-up internet? And that's a fun one to have. But also the conversation can very genuinely be, how did we break so completely when it comes to our care and our humanitarian aid? What was that rift? And maybe the adults don't have an answer for the kids, but it can begin the conversation. And I thought that was pretty valuable. So yeah, very long-winded answer, but it was basically state politics and just being cast back into history, very recent history, and probably realizing that much as I love books that are set in World War I and World War II, or look at the Vietnam War and try to understand how Australia got to be where we are, I thought, no, there's much more recent history that goes a much bigger way to explaining how we got to the present, which I think was really important.
Thank you. And I think, absolutely. And what's beautiful about the way that this all plays out in Danielle's novel is that you see people in the very small community in which, you know, Winifred is living with her family, going to school, reacting largely, with open arms, as you just said. And the few people who have got bigoted or outmoded ideas are quickly shot down.
Yeah.
And that is important for younger readers in framing, you know, and you're not didactic about it. You know, you leave it up to the reader to decide what's right and what's wrong. And as Winifred goes through that journey and learns from her teachers and her stepdad and the people around her and her friends, I think readers are left to draw their own conclusions, but are also gently guided by the way you shape the story and the community response to
thank
what's
you.
happening.
Well, even the section that I read about the National Anthem, that's lifted from my cousin, who's a primary school teacher, who said that they had that exact conversation in the classroom, because they sing it in that monotonous happy birthday voice every single morning.
Yeah.
And, you know, you're crazy to think that kids aren't going to pick up on these things, that they don't pay attention to what they're saying and singing and being told and taught in school, to then make the leap of saying, hold on, you're not practicing what you're preaching. So there's a few of those conversations in the book that are lifted straight from the true stories of the classroom, from people in my family who I totally pilfered from.
Absolutely.
Don't tell them that, though.
If you come from a family full of teachers, that's like that's a rich vein. You've got to mind that.
Open slather.
Yeah. And may I say, I love the Lord of the Rings quote Mr. Perry has on the blackboard. I mean,
I like quotes on walls.
Yes.
Yes, I think it's very appropriate.
Thank you, Danielle. All right, Nicki, you're in the hot seat again. So, in the Detective's Guide to Ocean Travel, as you said earlier, the characters are fictional, but this beautiful, magnificent ship on which all the action takes place, which I think I mentioned earlier to you, seems sort of like Great Gatsby on the sea in a way. The RMS, I'm not going to pronounce this properly, Aquitania. Right? So the Aquitania was a real ship who made her first voyage in 1914, but the action of your story takes place post the sinking of the Titanic, so in 1927, is that correct?
Yes, and post the sinking of Aquitania's sister ship, Lusitania, sunk by a German submarine during World War I. So this was an era of, there was a lot of danger on the high seas, as well as glamour and luxury. It was actually a big undertaking to go from the United Kingdom or from Europe to America. It was a big deal.
And I'm really interested in, again, as with Danielle, the very subtle but also very clear commentary on class distinctions that we see in your book, because Pepper, is it okay to say who Pepper is? That she's the daughter of
the captain.
Right, good.
Yep.
So she's travelling first class.
Yes.
But she befriends some people on board who are not. So I've got lots of questions, but let's make it easy and just start with one. First of all, why the fascination with this particular time and place? And also, can you tell us a bit more about the ship? Because I know you've got some
I've
props
some of my
and
interesting research materials.
I want to see them.
One thing that I didn't bring, I actually have a little badge, which is a souvenir badge from the maiden voyage of Aquitania, which is pretty exciting. Gives me the shivers. I don't think it was from first class, because you can see the newspaper backing inside the frame, inside the back of the badge. It's kind of gives me the shivers. But to your question about fascination with the 1920s, so we're talking about 100 years ago, but this is definitely not a time of olden days fustiness. So the 1920s, and perhaps for some of the younger audience members, it was called the Roaring Twenties, particularly in the United States, because this was a time of huge social change, a lot of excitement, a lot of glamour. The old ways were falling away, and it was an age of wonders. People were astonished by, for example, these great ocean liners. And it was something, when I was writing this, it really struck me that there are so many marvels that we have around us all the time that we can be a little bit blasé now. But people were living excitement back then. And really my fascination with the era started when I was 17 years old. At high school, we studied The Great Gatsby by F. Scott Fitzgerald, really the defining novel of the jazz age, the 1920s in America. And F. Scott Fitzgerald actually coined the phrase, the jazz age. When I was a little bit older, so in my 20s, I decided to embark on the mad escapade of adapting The Great Gatsby in graphic novel form, and this is the result. So I got to know that Gatsby world quite well, and it's always attracted me. When I decided I was going to embark on the Detective's Guide, I had to do a lot of research, not only into that era, but specifically into the life and society of these great ships. And it's fascinating. It's a lost world. These ships don't exist anymore. A few people who have written reviews and things have referred to it as a cruise. It was definitely not a cruise. So now we go on great big enormous ships, perhaps for a pleasure cruise. Back then it was the only way to cross. And so it was a very different world on board these ships. And one of my favourite bits of source material, I did a lot of reading of secondary sources, people writing history about the golden age of ocean liners, but the primary sources, things written at the time, were absolutely fascinating. And this one here, The Frantic Atlantic by Basil Woon.
Such a good title.
This was published in 1927, and this was a tongue-in-cheek, witty guide by man about town Basil Woon for Americans thinking of embarking on one of these voyages. And there's this fantastic whole kind of genre of American guidebooks written around this time that make you feel like you are immersed in the world of speakeasies and people doing the Charleston and just the whole wild life of the 20s. And thought I would read you the inscription in the front of this book. It's dated June 25th, 1929, and the gift giver has written to Dear Mrs. something I can't read. Wishing the few intervening moments between seasickness, you may enjoy this book from one of your admirers, Mary S. Naylor. And I feel like I'm almost embarking on that voyage with Mary S. Naylor aboard one of these great liners. So books written at the time were incredibly useful. I read the memoirs of the purser of Aquitania, the ship's most famous purser. Fascinating.
Can you tell us who a purser is? Because some of our younger audience
Yes.
members might not know what a purser is or what they do.
For sure. So the purser is a really important person on board the ship because they don't get involved with the sailing of the ship, the organisation of all of the crew involved in running it, but they look after the hotel side of things. So they have hundreds and hundreds of staff. There are a lot of staff there catering to these passengers' every need and every wish, and the purser is in charge of all of that. The purser is also the banker of the ship, looks after money and valuables, and the policeman of the ship. The ship does have a prison, it has a brig, and this is to give you a sense of the size of the ship. We're talking the size of the Titanic, thousands of rooms, and 4 enormous engines, 4 funnels so enormous that 2 motor cars could drive through a tunnel. If you laid it down on its side, which they did as a promotional exercise, they laid down a tunnel on the dock and 2 motor cars could drive through it. So enormous. And above my desk, I had a big picture, a cutaway of Aquitania that was published as a promotional poster back around this time. And you could see little cutaways of all of these cabins, engine rooms, dining rooms, lounges, smoking rooms, and then the very cramped quarters of third class and of the crew members. I needed that because there's a lot of hijinks that go on in the book. There's a lot of movement through parts of the ship where our young sleuths are not allowed to go. And in order to move them around accurately, because I'm a stickler for accuracy in a thing like this, I needed to be able to see where they'd be going and how they would get there. And the machinery, the architecture of these ships boggles the mind.
Particularly considering that they're built in the early 1900s. I mean, we won't talk about how many of them sunk, but the ones that were fortunate not to sink, they're miracles of engineering.
Most of them didn't sink, but there were frequent accidents. I've been reading in research for the sequel, which is a bit exciting, which is not set on a ship. But I was reading around that and just happened to come across a newspaper article from the time where one of these great ocean liners crashed into a fishing barge in New York Harbour, and 20-something people were killed. This was just part of the reality, really the dangers of being out on the sea. One of the books that I read in my research was called The World's Greatest Shipping Disasters, the cheery title. And it turns out I would have thought that collision was, not collision, I would have thought that weather was one of the biggest destroyers of ships. Actually, fire and collision are two of the biggest. So yeah, very, very interesting.
Can I just ask, after the Titanic, the unsinkable ship sunk, were people nervous about travelling on ships again, or was it just sort of a blip?
No, I think it was traumatising.
Okay.
People were traumatised that this had happened, and one of the boasts of the shipbuilders of Aquitania. So there were two main transatlantic shipping lines. There was the one that built Titanic, the White Star Line, and there was the Cunard Line. Aquitania is a Cunard ship. And one of the boasts of the Cunard Line when they launched Aquitania was enough lifeboats for everybody on board.
Oh.
Yeah. So there's a moment where Pepper's governess, who is very nervous and very anxious about getting on this ship, when they first see the ship, which is quite a moment, Pepper notices that Miss Quacken appears to be counting the lifeboats.
Yeah.
Fair enough.
And if I may, I think that the trauma of the Titanic it looms large, and especially for Pepper, there's a mention of this on page 78, I think. Can I read a couple of sentences? So it had been 15 years since the sinking of Titanic, the mammoth ocean liner destroyed by the kiss of an iceberg on her maiden voyage. Pepper had not been born yet, but the story of the disaster glinted like a frozen splinter deep in her mind. So good. So good. I'm sorry, I just had to read that out aloud to an audience because that's a sample of the language. I want to talk about that a bit later on. But I have another question, if that's okay, for both of you. And I'm just sort of mindful of time, so I'm going to skip ahead a bit. So both of you deal with history, and yet it's really interesting that you haven't written non-fiction works of history. You've written historical fiction for what we typically categorize as, middle grade readers. So I'm wondering, and whoever wants to go first, please just jump in. What's the value of historical fiction, regardless of the intended audience, but also for middle grade, when it comes to how we understand history? Why is historical fiction important across the board, first of all, and secondly, why is it important when we're writing for middle grade or younger readers?
I think in middle grade, a lot of big historic events don't often include children or young people. It's often adults are the big players, are the big movers and shakers. So I think fictionalizing allows you to insert younger people so that young readers can see themselves reflected on the page and can see how world events are affected by young people of the time. When young people ask me who my most disliked character is in my book, I always say, well, John Howard. And I do just think I wouldn't much enjoy writing a fiction book or a non-fiction book that had to play around with all those players, all those politicians. That's the other thing, you're mostly writing about politicians. I'm not terribly interested in how politicians move around the chessboard. I'd much rather know how regular people act and react to big historic events. And I think we all understand that now, having living through a pandemic. We don't really know what's happening in the boardrooms and, those powerhouses. We're not sitting in on those conversations, but we know what it's like to be impacted by this. And young people completely understand that as well. Though they didn't live through the events that I'm detailing, they completely understand my title, The Year the Maps Changed, a year in which the very ground beneath your feet feels like it's shifting and moving and you're being swept away by it. And they completely understand, when I say to them, I wrote this because of events that happened in my childhood that ended up being very big. And when I turn around and say to them, what's happening in your childhoods that you think you'll want to talk about later on? They completely know what's happening in the pandemic. And, you know, the other thing is writing historic fiction, it's life with the boring bits cut out. That's 100% accurate. I think sticking to narrative, non-fiction, or just a non-fiction book, I would like to tackle it. I would like to attempt, but I think I would have to attempt something that did have children or young people as the focus. Because I think young people need to see themselves on the pages of books and in the pages of books that are about history, to know that the world turns around them as well. Because there's a lot in life that kids don't think they're participants in our society. You know, they can't vote, they don't get a lot of say, they'd have to do what the parents and guardians in their lives tell them to. So I like centering kids. I like letting them know that they are the masters of their own domain, the masters of their own story. And the big focus in my book is one young person realizing that they are connected to the grander world around them. They are a member of their world community, which I think is important for kids to know. And yeah, like I said, had I written this closer to fact of history, it would have just been a lot of politicians talking. And I'm not.
No one wants to hear that.
I don't need to. If I want a dose of that, I'll watch Insiders. But I don't want to write about that. I'm much more curious and interested in how kids are affected by history. And I think kids understand that as well, knowing that they're currently living through it. So yeah.
Absolutely. And I love what you said about centering the child, because like many marginalised groups, children do get left out of historical or official accounts. You know, and yet your protagonist, Fred, just brings this innocence and wisdom to her circumstance that I think would be more difficult to achieve with an adult protagonist, or it would just be completely different. And that you give her agency, you give her a sense of power and empowerment, that she can effect change in her world by following her heart and following her own moral compass and doing what she knows is right, even if that's going to get her in trouble, even if it goes against, you know, some conservative opinions. And I think that's just fabulous.
You know, she has to learn that.
She has to learn it.
I was also very inspired by kids of today. We see them at the school strike for climate. Yeah. They've reached a conclusion that Barnaby Joyce still hasn't, for goodness sake. Yeah. They're leaps and bounds ahead of all nationals and conservative politicians. That's absolutely incredible, but also not, because have you spoken to a kid? They're really smart. I'd rather have a child as the deputy PM than Barnaby Joyce.
I'd rather have a guinea pig as the deputy PM. Anyway.
You can quote us on that. So no, I was very inspired by kids of today. The school strike for climate in particular, kids get this stuff. What I'm writing is not anything new to them. They're going through the exact same coming of age as what Fred is, which is one of empathy and one of knowledge and one of gaining a little bit more knowledge about the world around them.
Brilliant. Absolutely brilliant. Thank you. And Pepper, she's not just the star, but she's also an amateur detective in the time-honoured and hallowed tradition of Miss Marple and Hercule Poirot, whose name I can never pronounce. But, you know, she's like an Agatha Christie heroine distilled into something fabulous and unique in her own way. Tell me a little bit about why, for you, a child protagonist and a child focalizer is so important.
Well, if you want to write detective fiction, you will have an easier time of it if you have an adult detective. I can tell you. So I was an Agatha Christie tragic as a kid. I think I read 66 of her books, and I loved them. If you've read any Agatha Christie's, you would know that Poirot and Miss Marple have fantastic access to all the suspects. They can interview everybody. The police stand aside and let them conduct the investigation. Now, if you are a kid in 1927, or today, in fact, on board a great ocean liner, and a fabulous jewel goes missing, you are not in the position where you can go about and interview all of the high and mighty guests who are involved in this crime, because while our central characters are 4 kids, the people who are the suspects, and there is a big cast of eccentric characters who are suspects, are all adults. Well, not all the suspects are adults, but I won't give anything away. So it's really tricky being a kid detective. You don't have that kind of access, so you've got to find your own ways. And it was a real logistical challenge, and a challenge for mental challenge for Pepper and her friends to somehow get in behind the scenes and solve this. And it really was challenging for me as well. But I loved it. It was, I mean, even things as simple as Pepper is 13. Her father is running the ship. Her mother's dead. We know this from early on, but I won't reveal the circumstances. And she's sent with a governess. Now, this governess is very prim and proper and wants to keep an eye on her. She has got to constantly be slipping Miss Quacken so that she can go about all sorts of places that she shouldn't to go trying to solve this mystery. And her father, she's doing this in part to salvage the reputation of her father, definitely doesn't want her to be doing it. So it's very tricky for a young detective. Some of you might be familiar with the Murder Most Unladylike series, which is wonderful, set in a posh English boarding school in the 1930s. Those girls have the great advantage of being off in dorms, often without a great deal of supervision, and solving mysteries in and around their school often. So I think I had a trickier task of getting Pepper out of the eye of the people who were watching over her.
Can I just say that bout of seasickness was very convenient?
Well, Miss Quacken gets terribly seasick. When I started to write Miss Quacken, I was not very sympathetic, and in my mind, it was all in Miss Quacken's mind. You know, she was a bit of a nervous Nelly, and really that's why she was so sick. And then while I was in the midst of writing it, I went on a little research trip in connection with a different book, in connection with one of my picture books, and that involved going out on the Great Barrier Reef on a boat and going snorkeling. I was so sick, so horrendously ill for 7 hours straight. I came back and was far more empathetic towards poor Miss Quacken, and I understood that her seasickness was very, very real.
It does effectively get her out of the way, because otherwise how is Pepper going to move around and have adventures, as you said?
That's it.
But I do have a soft spot for Miss Quacken, and not just because she's so terribly ill, but you know, I sympathise. She all the characters in your book are marvellous, and they all feel incredibly real, and so do yours, Danielle. And I think one of the magical and beautiful things about middle grade and young adult fiction is when writers can somehow pull off that magic trick so that the characters, you know, they start occupying a little bit of space in your brain, and I shouldn't gesture with the microphone, they carve out this little space in your mind. They live there and they become real, like real people. And that's certainly what I've taken away from both of your books. We have a little bit of time for audience questions. So I'm wondering if anybody would like to ask a question of either of our writers, and I certainly have plenty of questions of my own, so don't feel pressure to do this. But we have someone wandering around with a mic. Yes, there's a question in the middle here, please, Ferris.
Hi there. Yeah, I'd just like to say I really enjoyed Danielle's book because it's on Audible. I'm wondering, Nicki, whether you're going to have yours on Audible at some point, because it's so much easier just to listen to stuff if you're working and driving around and stuff. So hopefully, because I've taken your book up, I haven't had time to read it.
Oh, right.
But
I hope so. I don't know.
So that's why a question to Danielle, which is, I was thinking about the ending of your novel. Were you tempted in any way to have, there were a couple of things I thought could have happened, which was that Annika gets the baby and the baby is left, or that Mr. Curry ends up marrying Nora. Did either of those things cross your mind? and why did you not do that? Because you leave it quite open.
Yeah.
I just wondered.
My ending, I attempted an ending, I think 3 times. And 3 times my editor said, not quite. Nope, not quite. And my lovely editors, Karen and Kate, wouldn't give me more than that. They wouldn't. Unfortunately, editors don't tell you, no, this is what you should be doing. You write from point A to point B to point C, please. They just tell you yes or no. And there is a lot of figuring out that you've got to do between those two. You want the yes, you don't want the no. And I got the no 3 times because I think I was trying to write a tidier ending. And each time Kate said to me, nope, you don't have it yet. You don't have it yet. Because I knew from where I was sitting in my lofty position in the present, being able to look back at the past and being able to see the repercussions of Operation Safe Haven to now. And we all know the awful things that have happened with refugees and asylum seekers in this country. And in particular, there was the Tamil family from Billawheeler who was being housed on Christmas Island, a family of 4 for no good reason. I thought, I can't write a happy ending in this book, knowing that the political events here lead to where we are now, which is somewhere really inhumane and morally compromised. But I also, knowing that I'm writing for children, I have, as both an agent and an author, I have this rule that you can't leave on hopelessness, because that's also not true for kids. So I had to find something in the middle, and that was an open-ended. So I'm quite happy if my readers read my ending and, tack on a reader, I married him at the end or something, if that's what they want to have in their mind. Or if they're a bit more like me and had to be grounded in reality a little bit and know that probably there's a long few years held up in red tape and bureaucracy before a little bit of humanity can be shone in, maybe. And I happen to know that from the 4,000 or so Kosovar Albanian refugees that came over to Australia, only about 400 were given permanent residency here. And that was hard won. That was really, the government did not want them to stay. It was a different case in the US and UK that has a pretty hardy community of people from Operation Provide Refuge. There are some famous people also who came out of Kosovo at the time. For the young people in the audience, Rita Ora, her and her family fled the violence. Dua Lipa, her family are also Kosovar Albanian, and they fled the violence and settled in the US and UK respectively, or both the UK. Young people will know more than I do where Dua Lipa lives. There was much more a resettlement out of the US and UK than there was in Australia. So you could absolutely see the beginnings of where we got to with the policy. And actually John Howard baked into Operation Safe Haven, he baked into that policy what we have now, which is providing temporary asylum. We hadn't had that before. We never had the word temporary in association with refugees and asylum seekers. And John Howard baked that in before allowing them to come over to Australia. And then that has carried through to now, where we only offer temporary asylum, which is what we're seeing now when we're saying we can't resettle refugees who get here illegally. It's not illegal to seek asylum. And those who do try and seek asylum have got so much red tape to go through. So I was very much writing this from the present, and I just couldn't put a happy ending on it because I know where this leads, which is the beauty and the heartache of writing historic fiction is you are writing it from a lofty height of knowing how it all ends up. And maybe it all works out fine, but maybe it doesn't. So I didn't get that yes from my editor until I put a little bit more realism into it. And that was leaving it open-ended. Very much so.
It's really, I'm sorry. We have another question up the back.
Danielle, I really like the way you bring current issues into your fiction for historical fiction for kids. And I'm thinking back to the launch of Love YA Oz, and how, without taking anything away from American YA like Stephanie Meyer and whatnot, you were passionate at the time about the need for Australian young adult fiction.
Mhm.
And I wondered if you could talk a little more about that, please.
Yes. The Begin and Begin came out because back in 2016, that was where we saw a real drop off of Australian kids were not reading Australian stories in young adult literature. I think the adults and guardians and parents in the room probably know that you start losing kids as readers about in year 10. They've got a lot of things drawing them away from reading, and they could be doing way better things. Middle grade's going pretty well. Middle grade has got lots of voracious readers, and that's where you can really hook kids and make them readers for life by giving them lots and lots of options in middle grade. But no matter what, once they hit a certain age in YA as teenagers, there's so much more stuff they have to do. They've got so much more commitment in their schooling. It's hard for them to grasp onto books again. And we really found this in 2016. We had a few statistics come out that saw borrowing habits from public libraries. Public libraries started keeping a tally of the most borrowed books, and there were 4 categories: adult fiction, adult non-fiction, children's books, and YA. And in 3 of those categories, it was an even split. Half Australian authors, half international authors, except in YA. In YA, there was only 2 Australian authors featured in the most borrowed books. And of course, it was hard to extrapolate from that data. We didn't know if it was actual teenagers borrowing from public libraries. Maybe it was adults borrowing young adult literature, 100%. But very much you could see from that data where the swings were going. It was a lot of Twilight. It was a lot of John Green, who was being adapted at the time. It was a lot of the Divergent books by Veronica Roth, which I call the detergent books. It was a lot of Maze Runner. It was a lot of anything being adapted by America from YA literature was what kids were reading. That statistic has only gotten worse. I believe now, for the last 2 or 3 years, there's been no Australian creators on the most borrowed YA list. And again, that list is crowded out by adaptations of American literature appearing on Netflix. It's Leigh Bardugo's Shadow and Bone series right now. It's been Jenny Han. These are great books. They're brilliant books. But more than adult literature even, I think, they've got the might of US publishing and then the might of Hollywood and then the might of streaming services behind them. And it's very hard for Australian YA creators to get a look in and convince kids to read stories from their own backyard. And what we were saying with this anthology, the reason we created it was to start a conversation about, hey, look at how wonderful our Australian YA creators are, writing across every genre on every topic. But also it was a way to crack open this conversation with everyone and say that we need young people to read Australian stories so that they grow into adults who also read Australian stories. Or else we're going to live in a desert landscape where publishers won't invest in Australian storytellers. They just won't. It's been good to see things like Jane Harper's The Dry just take off in every single realm and respect. That was the number one. Actually, I think last year was the first time that in Australia we had 5 Australian films in the top 5 of the box office. That hadn't happened in our history before. We'd never had 5 Australian films as the top 5 of our box office. The Dry was number 1, and that was only because America wasn't creating, the UK wasn't creating. We were creating films and content still. And you're going to see an absolute run-on on content coming soon because a lot of our authors have been acquired because American streaming services, American companies, American producers need content, and we could film here. And there were some really good Australian stories that got up. So you're going to see in the next few years a wealth of this content, but not much YA literature, unfortunately. That's still very hard. We're very much still competing with the Americans on that. And honestly, the only way to battle it is to have these conversations, for parents and guardians to sit down and ask their kids, what are you reading? Why are you reading that? And probably the answer is going to be, oh, well, it's on Netflix, so I want to catch up with it. Or my friend recommended it. Where did your friend get it from? TikTok. Oh, okay. You know, and TikTok is commanded by the Americans when it comes to book talk. I was just telling Nicki that one author who had a book release, an American author, had their book release in 2017 with the great title, it's Adam Silvera's They Both Die at the End. And because it's that great title, it got picked up by Book Talk last year. to the point that in a single week he sold 17,000 copies. That's what we're competing against. He's now number one on the New York Times bestseller list for YA again because of a very organic social media word of mouth praise of him. It's hard for Australians to compete on that, even on the basics. TikTok has got 500 million users. 25 million of those are American, only 2.5 million are Australian. So just on that basis, it's really hard to get up. But we have to have these conversations about why is it important for Australians to read Australian stories? Why does it matter? Something that I always do is, can I get a show of hands in the room? Who here has read Possum Magic? Amazing. I can tell you right now, if I was to sit in a room in Idaho in America and ask the same question, not a single hand would go up. Because there is something magical about reading stories of your own backyard. There is something that connects each and every single one of you, no matter your background, no matter where you're from, at some point in your life, you have either had somebody read you that story or you have read that story to a little person because that story matters to you. That is a thoroughly Australian story. Possums are very different between America and Australia, for one thing. There is something magical that we have all been gifted that story in some capacity. We have to keep that magic going. And that is a story of a picture book. We've got to keep that magic going through, picture books, board books, junior fiction, early readers, middle grade. And then young adult, there seems to be this huge leap where we have to bring them back into reading Australian stories. Because my fear is all those teenagers who have not grown up reading Australian stories, what do they do as adults? Do they think that America speaks for them? Do they think that their lives are not worthy of appearing on the page? And we have to also acknowledge this is across pop culture as well. We're currently seeing our politicians debating whether or not there should be quotas for television channels in Australia to make creative Australian content. They don't want to have to make Australian television of scripted storytelling. It's too much of a burden for them financially. They'd prefer not to do it. We're having to convince them, no, please keep investing in Australian stories, because if it was up to them, they would just keep streamlining us rotten, awful reality television from America and just slapping Australians into it and saying, job done. The only place that is making honestly good scripted storytelling is ABC and SBS. And that's been true for a long time. And what do they want to do? They want to halve the ABC budget. They don't want us to tell Australian stories anymore. Why? What stories are we telling that they don't want us to?
Stories like yours.
Damn right. I think it's very important to keep having that conversation about art is not an indulgence. Art is us looking back at ourselves. And what happens when teenagers are not afforded that? It's not necessarily their fault. They're not setting out. I don't think many teenagers care where the books they read come from. It's not one of the first questions they ask themselves. But we have to start asking, what can we do to help that along? To make sure, like I said, young people who read Australian stories grow into adults who read Australian stories. And that's how we keep this thing going.
Yeah, here. Well said. We have time for one more quick question. No, we're done. We're at time. Sorry, folks. We can... Yes, we have time for one more question.
Go.
I can ask mine later.
Oh, cool.
Yeah.
Hey, I'm an interested writer too. Haven't published anything yet, but anyway, I'm thinking of like stories, like you said, from I'm about your age, and also besides that, I know people in my life with disabilities, and myself, I've been bullied, and others that have been bullied as well growing up. How do you feel about, writing stories but putting a spin on disabilities and being bullied, and kind of putting that lesson in there about, treating people with kindness and accepting others and stuff like that?
Mm-hmm. I think that's incredibly important.
Yeah.
Speaking as an agent,
Yep.
I represent people like Carly Findlay, who's
Yep.
an appearance activist, a disability activist.
Mhm.
She's taught me a lot about the social model of disability and how lacking any kind of pop culture in Australia is of a disability experience.
Yeah.
And I mean, even this has repercussions. We know, for instance, right now, the disability sector is not being vaccinated. Their vaccination rate is abysmally low. I think it was 1.5% when I last looked. We have real world consequences when we don't portray enough people and their breadth of life and experience. You don't understand them, you can't empathize with them, you don't care about them. So it is incredibly important. The other thing I will say is a quote that I like to do with publishing generally. Publishing is very white, heteronormative, middle class, probably. It's very one note. And I would say if you don't have a seat at the table, you're probably on the menu. So it's probably also very reflective.
I like that.
It's probably
Yeah.
very reflective of who works in publishing. I'm included in that.
Yeah.
We're the ones who choose who has some say in what gets published.
Mm.
So we need to have more representation behind the scenes as well. Because it can't just be the onus on the creators to make diverse stories and to put themselves on the page, which can be very traumatizing as well. So it comes down to, and I know publishers in Australia are trying to diversify their editors in particular. I know my publishing house, Hachette, has got an internship going, a paid internship with Indigenous First Nations people and people from diverse backgrounds who are going to shadow established editors so that they can then go off and be their own editors and seek out more diverse stories. I know many publishers are trying to do this. But book publishing generally, to borrow from Nicki's book, is a hard ship to steer into more diverse waters. It is big and bulky, and it is ultimately a commercial enterprise, and we need the bigger publishers to really show us the way as well, and they're not necessarily doing that. And you are all consumers, and you should tell them that. You should tell them, if you really have to rack your brains and think about the last time that you read a book by a disability activist or by a disabled author or by an author from First Nations, if you really have to rack your brain and think, who was the last author like that I read, we have a problem, and you should be vocal about that as both consumers and creators. And you shouldn't just accept, what's on the shelves. You can absolutely write to your publishers. You can also access them across social media in unprecedented ways. Goodreads, amazingly, publishers turn a lot around Goodreads, which is a social media page designed for bookish people and readers. Let it be known. If you think that your reading is very homogenous and one note, let it be known. And if you yourself are a creator from a diverse background, keep trying, because we are looking for you. Absolutely.
You'll find on the top menu there's an Indigenous reading list. And over the last 10 years, I've been hosting this particular reading week. Nothing really. People of all sorts have read all kinds of books by Indigenous authors. And so there's a list of them for you to choose from: kids' books, YA, you name it, all that with reviews by bloggers. So you know where to look now.
ANZ Lip. Brilliant.
It'd be fantastic if you do what my local library does, which is have a little display for Indigenous Literature Week. Just have a little shelf, books by Indigenous authors, and so you can come on the website and tell them what they thought of the book.
I think Blarney is pretty happy being inclusive. I'm just counting the rainbows. I think they're pretty happy being inclusive. But absolutely. Very good point. ANZ Lit Lovers blog. Absolutely, 100%.
Thank you for that.
Thank you so much. The only flaw in what you're saying is for me, as far as I know, I don't have any Indigenous. Apart from that, it sounds great. But I will keep trying. Thank you so much.
Please do. Please do.
People, we are over time. So I know that you all have so many questions for both of these wonderful authors. You can look them up. You can follow them online.
please buy their books before you leave today if you haven't already got yourselves a copy. And will you join me once again in saying thank you to Danielle and Nicki for today's session. Thank you.
Well done.
And we have a little gifty for you both. So thank you so much.
Thank you.
And I could listen to your rant about publishing and our treatment of
Politics.
asylum seekers and all
I
the
would
rest of
happily.
it. All day.
I would happily.
Thank you very much, and
Thank
thank you,
you.
Kate.
Somebody's got to take a photo of us. We have somebody, a young person that can work technology.